ji to please give the recap of yesterday's sessions. Over to you, Amita ji.
Thank you, Nishikant ji. Good morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Amita ji.
Hello.
Yes, you are. Yes, please go
Okay.
ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. From Water Group, I am going to do the recap of day three. The topic covered in day three was quite new for me, but were very interesting. The first presentation by James was on assessment method and complexities, in which we understood how there is a need to change the assessment method in order to account for the complexities. Because due to climate change, risk is changing from simple risk to complicated risks and then to complex risk. We also came to know about four types of adaptation, namely first is adaptation A, which is bottom, which is reactive type. Then second was bottom up, which is disconnected, and third was top down, which is also disconnected, and the last one was top bottom, which is connected type, which is multi-directional in nature. Means modelers, planners, and citizens all have participated in the process. This adaptation type D, which is top bottom, is the most important as it also integrates gender. Through the application triangle, we understood that how knowledge flows vertically as well as horizontally. And then James and Kim showed us a case study in which their approach was top bottom, means adaptation 4 type. Then we came to learn about evolution of methods, how methods have evolved from first generation in 1980s, where the question was, is there any climate change? And methodological approach was sensitivity analysis. To the fifth generation now, where the question is, do we see any change? And the methodological approach is implementation, monitoring, and review. Then the next session was of Charles. Charles discussed about global climate model and regional climate model and how in Canada he has used this regional climate model through downscaling the global climate model to develop forecast landscape model. We learned that what will be the scenario of landscape in year 2100 in Canada. He showed this very well. Then again, James and Kim talked about integrating bioclimatic features with socio-economic aspects. For this radar chart can be used. Through this radar chart, we saw that how gender is also integrated in the analysis process. Then Kanchanji and Adityaji very briefly explained the features of Kosi Basin Information System. After lunch, James let us understood about various risks, how exposure and sensitivity leads to potential impact, and then potential impact and coping capacity leads to vulnerability. Then from vulnerability to climate risk and to adaptation. There were a lot of new things I came to know yesterday. And then there was very interesting group activity where we discussed about our role in our organization and how are the direct how they are how who are the direct and indirect stakeholders of our work. And then we also discussed about who we are serving for. And then in the very last session, James and Kim talked about sensitivity assessment, adaptive capacity, vulnerability, risk assessment, and likelihood ratings, etc., etc. What I think that the evolution of methods and various adaptation types were quite interesting. I would like to learn more about them. I think I think water sector should go for adaptation type 4. But I guess there are limitations like resources, fund, time, etc. etc. That's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amita ji. I mean, it's very nice to also know your personal experience, like you mentioned. There are a lot of things you learned, and which were quite new to you, and you can actually take those learnings forward as well. So, thank you so much, Amita ji. And now, can I please request Xiao Yang Hu to please provide the recap from the forest sector? Are you there?
Uh, Yesterday we talked about climate vulnerability assessment Climate change will affect the entire Earth system, and it is necessary to conduct a climate vulnerability assessment. However, it is complicated. We need to assess climate change in the following steps. We need to determine future climate. We need to determine future impacts, and then identify, choose, and respond to it. They also need citizen action. The personnel involved in the assessment process include modelers, researchers, planners, citizens. We need to make knowledge flows out not only vertically but horizontally. In addition,
I think we lost you there, and I think you're muted as well. Could you check your microphone, please? I think it shows that you're muted. Okay, should we circle back to this sector? And then just while we do the other sector. So we'll come back to you. Just 1 second. So can I please now request Mohan Raiji to provide the recap from the agriculture sector, and we'll come back to the other sector after this. Mohan Raiji, over to you.
Yesterday it was quite an interesting day for me because yes, I got a chance to learn so many new things. So yesterday we learned about mostly about the climate vulnerability assessment. So how to determine the climate profile and climate impacts, and how to identify and choose the adaptation types. So we learn about there are 4 types of adaptation: the straight feedback, vague connection, or in adaptation types. We learn 4 stages, like straight feedback, vague connection, results and discussion, imposed and technosense, and the last one is citizen action. So in the same way, we got to know about the global climate model and regional climate model, and how the intersectoral synergies are like interrelated. And then after, we also learn about the hydrological watershed model conducted as a case study from Canada, and how it was like downscaling to forecast the landscape. And so we also we got to learn about the communication, different kinds of types of communication, like the vertical and horizontal, and the relation among the researcher, modelers, planners, and the citizens. So the very interesting part is I got to learn about the how we are doing our project, and who are our stakeholders, who are the direct and indirect stakeholders, and who are the vulnerable, how we are intervening to our stakeholders, and while doing our project, while conducting our projects. So what are the barriers, and the most important part is like how and who need to be included in our project. Yeah, thank you. So that's all about from my side.
Thank you very much, Mohanji. Very nicely captured. Thank you so much. Can I again request Zio Yang Hu to please continue for the forest sector? Are you there? Yes, please go ahead.
Could you hear me?
Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Yesterday we talked about climate change vulnerability assessment. Climate change will affect the entire Earth system, and it is necessary to conduct climate change vulnerability assessment. However, it is complicated. It needs to assess climate change in the following steps. We need to determine future climate and determine future impacts, and then identify, choose, and respond to it. They also need citizen action, and the personnel involved in the assessment process includes modelers, researchers, planners, and citizens. We need to make knowledge flows out not only vertically but horizontally. In addition, there are 5 milestones in climate change vulnerability assessment. It includes initiative, research, plan, implement, monitor, or review, and they need to be closely linked. And then in yesterday's afternoon, we talked about some questions. Who are you trying to serve in a specific project or policy? And who are the direct stakeholders, and who are the indirect stakeholders? And then we identify who can enable change, and who or what can create barriers for the positive outcomes of our work. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is very nicely captured. Thank you very much. Now, going forward to the next program, which is report back from the group, and this will be done by the group leads, which have been identified between the 3 groups. So to take this session forward, can I please request Bimla Lamaji to provide the feedback for the forest sector? Are you there, Bimla Lamaji? Bimla ji, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, Nishikant, I think we had our reporting back yesterday itself. So.
Okay.
James and Kim, can you confirm if we need to have a group reporting back right now?
No, I don't believe we do.
Okay.
I think the leaders will help lead us through when we work the group work this afternoon. They'll facilitate the conversation. So no, I think we're good.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much, Kanchan, pointing that out. Okay, so now apologies for that. So let's head into session D1, which is the value and risk response to challenging sectoral interdependencies, looking at expenditure pathways, perception, which is economic discounting, and followed by a group work on this decision pathways as well. So over to you, James and Kim. Very good evening to you. So please take this session forward.
Thank you so much. So we'll just have Jim share his screen and get ready, and we'll hop in today, and we'll take probably just a minute to recap what we learned yesterday, as you did, just to get us in the mode, and then we will go forward to some new learnings today. And I encourage you, of course, to put your hand up or put questions in the chat if there's a concept that we should maybe spend a little bit more time on. So here we go, Jim.
Okay, yeah, and I can't see the chat, so you can just obviously just say something and get me to slow down or what have you. I must admit, I'm really impressed with the recaps. I will certainly be talking to my students about, you know, what a great, I mean, how attentive and also that ability to sort of interpret. So it helps me a lot as well. So I had sort of planned a very quick recap, trying to sort of pull the pieces together, because during the day we tend to, well, we were, you know, moving around from different people. So generally speaking, just a quick recap. And here we have our pyramid, we have this vertical functionality and the horizontal functionality. And now we also know that case studies are incredibly important. That's where it all comes together. And that's where, in a sense, it's defined, and we can actually start to look at how we, even maybe how we tried some things, but they didn't work. Kind of sounds a lot like life. And so we have the 4 different adaptation types. And it's just a reminder, I just wanted to remind everybody, this is obviously a ridiculously simple heuristic. And as we know, heuristics are just meant to be used long enough to give us a sense of what's going on. And we leave them behind. It was inspired, though, by this critique of methodological completeness. So that's worth pointing out right from the beginning of the methods that we've used. And a lot of the modern sort of management science operations research, a lot of these methods came out of the 30s and 40s. And the 50s were like a heyday, and they, in the US in particular, but also Europe. And so almost immediately there was critique. Lindbaum was one of them that talked about this notion of completeness and how ridiculous it is. So the idea being that right from the start, we knew our methods were limited. You know, we had concepts like satisficing, we had concepts like muddling, and it's, you know, because it's a history of my field, I find it intriguing. But just to be aware that it's not just a simple heuristic, we're kind of making fun at the idea that there could be one method. In fact, there's many methods. So it reminds us that we should step back and look at function and look at that systems level function so that we can actually start to understand things. And data comes to mind in particular recently because everyone's talking about data, but data has to be seen within the context of other methodologies like risk methodologies. So everything has a component, everything sort of has a place, but flexibility tends to rule the day. Unfortunately, and I think, was it Kenley, asked, well, can you give us any advice? And that's a great question. And I thought about it, and I realized, well, of course, we'd actually Kim and I and our friends, we did an analysis. We did a couple of analyses. So the idea is that if we look at this pyramid, we can just look for trends. How simple is that, right? And what did we find? Well, we literally found, so this is 2018, we found that in terms of the horizontal nature, that there was some convergence towards a small number of models within New Brunswick. Now, this was for flooding, so a small number of hydrological models. So there tends to be a convergence. Oddly, if you go in the literature, it looks like there's hundreds, thousands of models, but there are only really a few that people really use. And we found that in New Brunswick, kind of like a historic overview. Vertically, we found only one complete pathway, and this was our colleague Matthew Muratori. He found only one instance of a complete pathway from the top in terms of the GCM modeling through the planner's risk assessment to an actual participatory, engagement with stakeholders. So one complete example. So it doesn't sound like much. But I wonder, this is 2018, things are kind of moving pretty quickly now. So that might not be the case anymore, in terms of that. So hold on, I'm trying to get this going. And then we found lots of little case studies, but they're always kind of truncated and that sort of thing. So can we? Yes, we can give advice. Another quick factor, and this is really important, in the early days and still today, there was a lot of choice in terms of the methods, but certainly horizontally, organizations like the IPCC have created special reports. We're talking about the SRES report famously from, 2000s, early 2000s, that standardized scenarios. And scenarios are a way of structuring the research, structuring the application, But it's interesting to note that even in terms of scenarios, shared socioeconomic scenarios are rarely used. Although the last special report, the land report, they seem to be an uptake of their being used. So can we give advice? Yes. Sorry, that was the correct answer. The correct answer is yes, we can give advice, but it's based upon literally analyzing, examining what people are doing. We can't give you advice definitively and say, you should use this. And then the last part, of course, is if governments say that you have to use a certain method, and certainly that's been the case in Canada, when a government comes in and says, you must use these scenarios and you must use this method, for us, a particular hydrological method, then you have to. And then everybody uses it, that sort of thing. Okay, so yes, we can give advice. Okay, so in terms of where this is all leading, case studies, and we saw this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the idea is that we can take, you know, the radar charts that, and we're using these as sort of the minimum. We can dive deeper, we can come out, we can look at disaggregated data. And so there's so many stories here, we could actually start talking about this for the next hour. And then, of course, we talked about the databases and, you know, where we can go online. And certainly we're going to be using this more, and certainly my students will. And then we obviously talked about specific cases where all these factors came together. And in particular for us, it was the Horse River wildfire, the Fort McMurray fire. And then, of course, we have some other cases, one of which, here's our Metrolinx partners down here. So oh yeah. And then the last little part, we actually talked about how we pull all this together. And the idea is that, yes, things can appear rather free for all, but the reality is, no, there is a structure, and we use the ICLI structure. And so when we walked through some of their workbooks, we chose, you know, 1, 6, 7, and 8. And so today we'll actually be looking at adaptation. So just to let you know, it's not just the risk assessment. We're leading to something, and the leading is adaptation. Now that's a different thing. Adaptation is adding something purposeful. An assessment is just an assessment. It's a comparison of risk and events, the sort of impacts that we feel we would be susceptible to. But adaptation is now being proactive. And that's kind of interesting, because the minute you say that, you are committing resources. And so I'm sure we all took economics. You know, unfortunately for me, it was a long time ago. But this notion at the core of economics is that, you know, it is about trade-offs, but ultimately it's about choice. That if you're committing resources to something, that's definitive. And so adaptation is something along those lines. Are you proactively going to do something given all your options? And so we'll be talking about that today. And anyway, we were looking at stakeholder identification, data, you know, the vulnerability and the risk assessments. And then this afternoon, well, if we get time, we will talk about adaptation within this context. Again, I'm sure much of this will be familiar to you or intuitive. Here's an attempt to pull it apart. Now, when I'm teaching this, typically I use a fundamental systems approach and, you know, introduce my students to systems analysis and then go towards, you know, something more specific like this. But fundamentally, it's quite coherent within that regard. Okay, and then you can go to the website and that sort of thing. So now we're going to talk about values and risks. And when we, you know, we're talking to Aditya and we were talking about, well, it'd be nice to have a section on values and risks. You know, in my head, I was like, values and risks, values and risks. So it's like, oh, okay, I think I know how to do this. Value, you know, for those of us who have a humanities background, I have a humanities background. It's like, ooh, that's like talking about culture. And we know that that's something that is there. We all know it, but it's difficult to put a finger on values like that. And so when we talk about value, we have to be very particular about identifying exactly what we're talking about. So we're going to walk through this, and we're going to use an example that pulls together risk and value and uncertainty, but within a decision. And so that's what the working group will be about. We have this decomposition, or delineation of all these aspects of objectives and response and things like that. But there's also those moments where we might not be aware of it, but we're actually making decisions about value. And embedded in value is risk. Now, to be a bit geeky, risk is something that has a history, and it is actually more recent. When I say more recent, within the last 50 years, that we had to come to an understanding of this concept and formalize it. Because throughout history, it's been there, but it's never been, we have instances of it. And we know we make decisions based upon risk in the formalistic sense, but that's been recent. And so we can talk about, if someone wants to talk to me about that, it'd be lots of fun. Anyway, so this is one of those sorts of things. We try to encapsulate all those elements into a single example. Okay, so here we go. How do we represent our values under risk and uncertainty? How do we handle the future? Well, let's go back to our examples. And so we do try to be coherent when we use heuristics or when we discuss decision making. When we are, with all due respect, talking about gender, we're trying to, come at it from an angle of, for us, systems, and we try to make all of that quite transparent. So one of those things is actually having these bioclimatic profiles. We see this one, and I know I didn't get a lot of time to talk about this, but when you start flipping these things around, it's actually a lot of fun, but it also trains you to, when you see climate data, you can also see, extremes within this graph. Now, you can't see it literally, but what do I mean by that? Well, this is a seasonal representation of a particular place in terms of their climate. And so what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that this is 30 years of data is the standard. It's aggregated, and we can see historical precipitation aggregated over 30 years. So in January and in New Brunswick, that'd pretty much be snow, eh, Kim? I would say it's snowing there right now, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, quite a bit of snow right there yesterday in on the East Coast. So January is snow, but we'll have rain during the summer. And then the temperature line, and you can see there's those two values. So yeah, this is very easy to read, but the history of this is actually interesting. Goes back over 100 years, and it's things like this that really helped us to understand ecological patterns within the world. Okay, talking too much already. But when we do this, we've added a layer of information on top of the traditional bioclimatic profile. This is a projection into the future. And there's actually probably not enough information on this, but we're just using it illustratively. This is a projection, I think, to 2080 using a particular GCM. So under those circumstances, we have projected in blue, how things will change. And if you can see there, it doesn't seem to be a lot, but we did this back when, 2015, 2014. And so things have changed a bit, and, we can actually talk about that. But we tend to, so my colleague and I, Quentin Quixote, we started using this diagram because we found it was stylistic, but very much like the bioclimatic profiles, it added a lot of very useful information in the first little bit. And it seems so trivial, but years from now, we're at time zero, 100 years from now, we can see stylistically that we're looking at changing global average temperature. Now, that's kind of ridiculous. It's sort of like taking the entire world and measuring it, and then every year saying, oh, the entire world's temperature is going up by 1.3, 1.5, that sort of thing. We lose so much detail in this, and yet it's still highly useful in terms of representing as a proxy for climate. It's just a proxy. So we have to remember that. We also know, and we probably all know this, that the projections we have into the future, we actually see a lot more water in the atmosphere. We know that water, is a greenhouse gas. We know it's going to be a lot hotter, and ergo, the atmosphere will have more water. So what's really happening is we have these two factors going on. If you look to the left, there you go. There's a bioclimatic profile. And if you look to the right, you can now see that the historical in red is time zero. We assume that represents time zero. Okay.
So we
but
actually have a bit of a question here, Jim, about change in annual precipitation. So one of the things we're finding in New Brunswick, and correct me if I'm wrong, and likely in Canada as well, is that the real change is in when the precipitation is coming. However, yes, we do have change in the amount as well. We're actually in New Brunswick, we're getting more precipitation just at different times of year now. Do you know, Jim, is that the same throughout where?
So we will talk about that, but it's increased variability. So when it's coming is incredibly important. And of course, the relationship between temperature and precipitation is really important too in terms of snowfall. But variability, and that's a really good point, because the diagrams on the left, we aggregate 30 years of data. Now, which 30 years? Well, often we have holes in our data, so it becomes a bit of a game. So in other words, just be aware that when we do these bioclimatic seasonal profiles, we're losing a lot of information. But we could put, bars on all of those measures and show you the variability. And in fact, Hansen has done, and this was going back, 2012, did a really interesting piece looking at the change in deviation through time. And through time, yes, the variability, the deviation from the norm has gone up. So we are seeing increased variability when and how that the precipitation is coming, for sure. That's one of the results. And so all we're doing here is kind of like showing you that we can encapsulate and pull everything together, but be careful, saying that we don't want to get beyond 1.5 has very different meanings in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, that means drought. In other parts of the world, more flooding. And in the same country, for example, Nepal, they're getting both. So these are really, really important things to note. And the historical, in this case, the historical time zero is represented by the red. The blue is then represented, I think we used 2080 at the time, so we'll just assume that's the case. And so we can see these changes. We're losing even more information when we go to a stylized chart like this, but it's highly useful. And so, we'll give you a quick example of why that's useful. Here's a great example. When we were doing an analysis of salmon vulnerability, this is kind of a funny thing. Instead of just looking at temperature, we had to include precipitation. Now, why? Well, when salmon are in rivers, they're very susceptible to overheating. And so salmon have a very particular range in terms of the North Atlantic. They can only be in rivers that are cold enough so they have enough oxygen. Well, how do we know the temperature of the rivers, how it's going to change? Well, we just look at the atmosphere and we say, well, there you go, it's getting too hot. No, we also have to add precipitation, because the precipitation is directly related to the flow rate of the river, which is directly related to the temperature. So what we had to do was, and not me, obviously, it was our colleague at INRS, Andre Saint-Hilaire, and with help from Philippe as well, and our friends at the Canadian Rivers Institute, we had to they modeled the entire watershed to get a measure of the flows so that we could make those statements. So in other words, it's not just temperature. And this is a great case because now we can use the bioclimatic profile to look at vulnerability for the life stages of salmon. And so we can start to see that, yes, salmon are kind of in trouble over the midterm. And that's something that we've can now tell our colleagues, because salmon is a big deal in New Brunswick, and, you know, in terms of the economy and sport fisheries and things like that. Okay, what else? Well, we can also look at, you know, this is work Charles has done in a very similar way to salmon. You can't just model temperature. In many cases, we assume trees will do better, forests will do better, increase temperature, increase carbon fertilization. There you go. But what really happened when he started modeling this was that certain trees, we definitively lost trees like balsam fir. And those trees were replaced by trees such as red maple. But then given the increasing temperature, and precipitation later in the century, we then lost red maple. Now, this is something nobody can do in their head. You have to model it. So the modelers, thank you. Thank you for doing this modeling, because now we know we have to be very careful in our forestry practices. And all this from this simple diagram. Well, it gets more complex. And this is why Quentin and I really like this, because and the interesting thing, this was done by consultants, so business people, whereas I would never have done this simply because I've been trained not to be so stylistic. But when they did it and I see it, I'm like, that's pretty nice. And it's nice for a couple of reasons. One, in this case, it's showing you that not only is climate temperature, not only is climate increasing precipitation, we know that that's a standard result from GCM modeling, but climate is also increasing variability and extent of extreme weather. And so we see that all those things are coming at us at the same time. It's kind of like the perfect storm. It's not just temperature, it's all the other factors. And in this diagram, we can see it in one place. So this is Mott MacDonald. We adapted it, but flash floods, tornadoes, heat waves, hurricanes, you know, on it goes. And you can see that the stochastic nature of these events, there's El Nino, the stochastic nature is represented by just a block. We don't know when the event will happen, but we can make calculations about its return period. So this is a really simple, beautiful diagram where we can actually get a lot of information out of it, but stylized, okay? So that would be, in this case, the work that we did in Charlotte County and how it was initiated by people like Kim, and initiated also by the catalyst of extreme weather. So this event resulted in this event. And so now we can start to see those correlations between these two things. Okay, and this, to get back to your point, Kim, extremes. Well, you can see that we're looking at increased magnitude of these extreme events, but it's kind of funny too, because if we had a certain distribution about, let's say, a return period of extreme weather, there has been some debate about the shape of the curve changing through time. All we mean by that is we can have a very well behaved, you know, we're going to get a storm, a really bad storm once every 20 years, let's say. But we know they're happening much more frequently. And it's not just that it's still 20, you know, it's just moving down in terms of the distribution. The distribution is also changing. So the tail means we will get some very extreme weather. And there's some recent results that look at this as well. So from this one diagram, we can get all this information. And that's exactly as you were asking, Kim. So one diagram, lots of information, highly stylistic. Why? Well, we want to add socioeconomic stuff into it as well. And so that's the point. So here we go back to our M charts, and we can start to see Blacks Harbor versus Blissville. And I remember Blissville, Kim, and there's a little bit of forestry around it. Blacks Harbor obviously has a sardine cannery, the largest in North America. And you can actually start to see, just as a quick refresher, the orange is, you know, these values for the province, you know, age dependency, income ratio, what have you. The blue is for the county. So that's a region. and the purple is for the actual community. So in this case, in Blissville, in terms of age dependency, they're not doing too well. So that's an issue for healthcare. And you can actually start to see that but the community is sort of like the other way around, income ratio and in terms of, in terms of income in these two sort of metrics. But here's the thing, those communities are doing these things. How do we get from just straight information to something else, something more useful, something more structured? Well, business cycles. And again, this is why we like the Mott-McDonald diagram. Decisions are typically made. So in this case, we are looking at, so to ignore the information on the left for a moment, we can see that from 0 to 100 years, we can start to unpack business cycles. And again, I never would have thought of this. This is why it's kind of cool. So in the first case, we're looking at business practices that occur on a yearly basis. And the one I just immediately comes to mind for me is taxation. And so this is an interesting thing. So you're saying the scale of the processes involved with taxation occur at a yearly time scale. And like, okay, that makes sense. But compliance cycles, once every 5-7 years, we've just went through one and I'm doing another one for a totally different thing. Isn't that fun? But 5 to 7 years. Business planning, 5 years. Economic cycles down there, about 10 years. Now, interestingly enough, in one of my former lives, I actually used to be a bond broker. And the longest period for one of our products was 30 years. And so the bond would have a maturity in 30 years. There's nothing longer. There are some products in Japan that actually go out certain mortgage products, but 30 years is about as far out as you go for financial products. And so we start to see that, these scales, and in this case, we can also look at infrastructure, have a very particular scale associated with them. Infrastructure in terms of the life cycle of assets, and we do a lot of work on that. And so here, in a sense, are human scales. And here's some more stuff in terms of assets and in terms of the beginnings of seeing how it's related to the environment. Okay, when we add the two, this is where we're going. So we see in this case scales, and the scales that the environment is, moving along on, but then we see the scales of the systems that we're a part of. And it's trying hard to see how a tax accountant can actually see what's happening over here and has the instruments to deal with this. Certainly compliance cycles, business cycles, and as I said, we would have 30-year Government of Canada bonds. That's it, 30 years. So many of the decisions we make are myopic to the events of climate change. So these scales are totally incongruent. So when you add climate to these considerations, standard practices typically are not suited to the inclusion of these scales. Now, we're all part of these scales, these human systems. And so there's almost like an inertia to be able to incorporate the threat of climate change given the systems that we're all involved in. And so as stated before, systems can literally, did I have that here? Okay. Decisions are typically made as they reach the decision maker in short, myopic fashion, not considering interdependencies, while a decision to purchase a piece of infrastructure is typically based upon all these sorts of things in reality. So that's another factor, and I should have mentioned it. Up here, infrastructure itself is also dependent on other infrastructure. So it becomes, once again, a very complex problem. We have scales that don't really recognize what's going on in the climate, and we have interdependencies between the operations of these different units. And so once again, we have a fair bit of complexity. Okay. So when we combine them, obviously that's the fun part, and we can actually start looking at other things. So in this case, this was part of the first time I was part of a national assessment. This was the 2020 National Roundtable Assessment. Oh, 2011. no, sorry, yeah, 2011. I'm getting old. But one of the things we did was we looked at changes in temperature, and we looked at change through time and how these different changes in temperature would affect these different elements. So ecosystems, water resources, communities and infrastructure, resource industries and what have you. So I remember being, part of a committee, and we were looking at this. And then I realized I could start incorporating these different elements quite simply into this framework. And so we have things like terrestrial habitat shifts, protected area biodiversity. The idea being that these things are going to start to be affected at these particular moments in time. Now, from a forester's perspective, for those of you in forestry, this is really important. This is scheduling decisions through time. That's what foresters do. We plant trees, we assume they'll live a long time, but we also plant them in such a way that we can harvest other trees while those trees are growing. And so scheduling and taking into account time is very fundamental to some of those longer cycles like we see in forestry. Guess what? This is also really important in the context of climate change, so that some of the skill sets that we have from forestry are then quite relevant to climate change, but also water management as well. Obviously, water management is, again, another very long perspective management process where we're looking at dams, we're looking at canals, we're looking at all sorts of bits of infrastructure, even sewers. Most of the sewers in Victorian Europe are only now starting to fall apart. And so in terms of asset management, I only know that because I've had to get so deep into asset management. So longer time scales are really at the core of us dealing with climate change. And as status quo, we're not very good at it. Okay. And that's really the only point. The point is to become aware of these scales and how we have to get past the inertia of just, once again, assuming that the systems of which we are a part will do okay under dramatic events. And the answer is no, we have to be aware of what those systems are and how they change through time. Okay, so we can also, this is a forestry example, so to kind of quickly go through it and then we can move on. Well, a forestry example in New Brunswick is a particular type of tree, balsam fir, has a rather short rotation, only goes out for 45 years and then we harvest it. Red maple, which Charles's modeling has showed us will supplant balsam fir, has a much longer rotation and two thinning cycles within that rotation period, one at 40 and one at 80. And then generally speaking, ecosystem cycles, we try to keep them going through long periods of time. And so we can see this in all sorts of different elements in terms of, increase, well, here's agriculture, increased crop yields, decreasing crop yields. Now this is a 2011 study, but we can actually start to get a sense of how these things are going to impact us, when they're going to hit us, how they're going to hit us. And of course, that's through time.
Right. And Jim, actually, Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
And one more. There you go. So this actually, especially when you talk about the crop yields, how it's, modeled that for a while they'll be increasing. And then at the 60-year period, the things will start to change and decrease. But this brings up a point that we have here on the chat on the side, where the question is the debate on climate change, which might benefit or disadvantage forest growth. We know that is, a debate. Are there any deeper discussions around this? So this is the same type of thing where we're talking, we know that there's going to be both benefits as well as disadvantages. And absolutely, we can point to some resources on that. And Jim, you might be familiar, a lot of Charles's work also has discussion on the benefit versus the disadvantage for forest growth.
Oh yeah, no. And in fact, for a little while, we were thinking mostly increase, large benefits. And we did a large economic analysis for this actual assessment. But it was interesting. And in fact, the much, praise to the people who did the analysis. They were at UNB, Van Lance and his student. But it becomes really complicated because we were looking at small growth increases in New Brunswick, let's say, right? But much bigger growth increases in Georgia. And so Georgia has forest rotation ages of only 10 years, 6 to 10 years, versus 45 in New Brunswick. So there was a sense that the market was actually going to get worse for New Brunswick because Georgia will be able to do, in the States, will be able to do that just so much more efficient.
I think, yeah, that's a really good point in all of this. When we look at all of this, and this is why for instance, international assessments aren't enough. We need to keep getting more localized because just as we, just as individuals, we have different situations and we come from different situations, our geography and that type of thing definitely has an impact on this very specific advantages and disadvantages that we'll all go through. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, Jim, is that we do want to move along because we know that we'll probably spend some significant time on the decision part. So I think you've set us up nicely here. Yeah.
Okay,
great.
well, I'll finish it off. Okay, so here we are. And I just while this is up, one of the big, again, 2010 degrees of change. That was 2010, the National Roundtable when we did that. Area burn 3 to 4 times greater. Well, this is, as we've seen last year and this year, in terms of fires, the projections they've been, bang on. So, we see this 3 to 4 times happening in 60 years, like, let's say 30, 40 years from now, but we're seeing those dramatic effects in terms of forest fires much sooner. Okay. Okay, so you get the idea that we can actually look at scales. It is actually quite important. Would you ask a tax accountant to help you with a climate adaptation plan? Well, yeah, you just have to be creative. Like, can that tax accountant identify, products where, we actually, and we do in Ontario, we have products where we are encouraged to invest in forestry, actually, so that we don't pay tax on the land if we're proactively managing forests. And you could use that vehicle from a tax perspective, obviously, to deal with climate change. Anyway, just as a sort of an aside, but generally speaking, the scales that we operate under have a hard time dealing with the scales that we're supposed to be dealing with. And, let's say I live another 40 years, which would be really nice, but let's say really more like 30 or 20, I don't know, I don't know. But that's it. If you look at 30 here, that's it. So why am I planning for this way over here? I only have about another 30 years. Well, that's what it's like to be human, right? And we'll talk about that. And that's what we're talking about in terms of value. Okay, so if we move this along, so how have we? Now, here's the thing. When we look at this conundrum and this problem, how have we dealt with it in the past? And what does risk have to do with this? Isn't it just simply we better learn how to do this better? Well, okay, so see, I had a section break, Kim, but I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're just really getting to the good stuff here now.
Yeah, actually. It's
Finance bores me.
It's a once again, it's a heuristic. These are really complex topics. And so I just try to come up with things that simplify them, but are theoretically coherent so that we're not claiming anything from diagrams like this, but we are typically theoretically coherent. So value and risk. Here's something you got to put out for the academics. Like, what do we mean by value? Well, okay, so I've actually started reading this book for fun. A colleague of mine, a historian at U of T, was, our kids, know each other, but under COVID, the whole story. So anyway, he was saying it's a great book, but look at their, value actually has a real, how would you put it? It's complex. Everything seems to be complex. So we have values in the sociological sense of what is ultimately good, proper, or desirable. I would say that's sociological, but sure, fine. In other words, it's prescriptive. And so when we talk about values, we typically talk about the values we should have. And so the minute we go to should, that has all sorts of philosophical implications. Okay, so we have that. We acknowledge that, we put it aside. And in fact, much of our discussion over the last week has been wrapped up in that. And in fact, some would go as far as to say we cannot disentangle our values from everything we do. That's true, but I'm a systems analyst, so we're going to put it aside for now. Value in a linguistic sense. Well, this reminds me, because I have a background in sociology, and yes, I'm aware of this. It's starting to go down this path, but okay, put that aside too. So when we started to talk about value, we thought, well, the easiest way to approach it for the time being, and especially because of climate change and the literature on adaptation, is in an economic sense. And in that sense, the degree to which objects are desired, particularly as measured by how much others are willing to give up to get them. And so, as we said, the minute we step over that line and we start talking about, well, I will give you this for that, now we actually have revealed value. And so this is what we're talking about. So yes, it's a smaller discussion, but if we were all in Kathmandu, we could have had the bigger one, but we're not. We're online. So here we go. Okay, so if we go back to this, it's a little bit of a game. And so in the tradition of, a lot of these things, such as, game theory and von Neumann and Morgenstern and what have you. So start off by assuming that you have 100 units. Now I say dollars, I'm going to get rid of that. It's just 100 of something. And it could be any type of resource that you have to give up to be able to get, what it is you want to do. So when we apply an adaptation option, it's going to cost something. It's not free, but that's okay. We're quite willing, if we value it, we're very willing to, give something up for it. Okay, so in this case, you have 100 units. The question was posed to me by, one of the pioneers of climate change adaptation, Ian Burton. And Ian had come to, what are we doing? Okay. I'm sorry, I just had a text from Constance. Are you there? Anyway.
Okay, yeah, just
okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay, well, we're almost done.
You just keep going, yeah.
Okay, so I'll start again. So you have 100 units, $100, 100 of something. And the question was, given that we know the pathway that climate will take, is there a pathway that we can actually map in terms of how we respond to climate change with adaptation? And that was his question. And so we did this with Ian and Brad, and we basically said, well, okay, if you had $100, let's say 100 units, how would you spend it? Well, this is what an economist would do. An economist would essentially not spend it. The economist would only spend the money when the actual need arose. And so this was a discussion back in 2007. The Stern report had come out, and there was a lot of discussion about, in this case, policy ramps, and the idea that we don't spend any money, we spend it when we need to. Now, this sounds a bit harsh, but in some instances, it's not a bad idea. If you do not have something that's manifested itself, like let's say an extreme storm event, you know that there's a probability that it could occur. But if you went around to every community, for us in New Brunswick, and made it climate proof, you wouldn't be able to spend that kind of money. Like literally tomorrow, make every community climate proof. That would be probably a waste of money, because you would be spending all that money today when in fact those extreme weather events might not happen for over 100 years. So why would you do that? That's the conundrum. So the conundrum is, in some respects, this sounds kind of harsh, but in another respect, it makes a lot of sense. So it's a type that we have in terms of how we spend money. So this one is, if you look across the bottom, you have 100 units, you don't spend, you don't spend, you don't spend, and then all of a sudden you spend. There you go. That's a policy ramp. Now, myopic economic agents will deal with climate change when it's an actual threat to profitability, and not a minute before then. They have a time preference for money and apparently an aversion to scientific uncertainty that outweighs climate risk. And this is Weitzman. Okay, so there you go. Now, if we discount this, discounting is also a perception. We won't go into this too much, but it's just very convenient that the discounted value of spending money so far in the future is almost zero. Okay, we'll put that aside for now. There are other types though, and this was the sort of the insight that, well, okay, that's one way of spending money, but we have other ways of spending money. And so a type 1 expenditure, that would be this one. You're actually spending all the money right in the very beginning, okay? And you're like, well, why would you do that? Like, I have $100 above normal operating, and it's to spend only on climate change adaptation. When would I spend it? Well, all in the very beginning. Well, we can imagine a dam. If you build a dam now and it's supposed to last for 300 years, that dam has to consider this climate simply from a safety perspective. And so we do have instances of this in terms of infrastructure around the world, but in Canada, absolutely. The PEI Bridge is an example of this. We've spent all the money up front, and then we just maintain it throughout the life of it. So is this something we do? Yes, we absolutely do this. In some instances, we know it's so important to safety and to people's lives that we're spending the money right now, okay? So the economist wouldn't spend any money until they have to, but we know socially that those type of values to society are so important that we will spend the money now and we'll spend it happily. Okay, so type 2 though is in the middle. Now, typically I think of agriculture. In agriculture, you have to stay in the game every year. You have to respond to the changing climate on an incremental basis. You're not going to plant crops that respond to this climate. You're going to respond to the increment through time. So this would be spend a portion of your 100 units throughout the entire cycle. And those are the 3 different types of adaptation. Adaptation 1, 2, 3. And they do represent value, but they also represent risk. Some people are risk adverse and so would favor spending money now. Other people are essentially risk seeking. They're quite happy to get a return, an economic return, versus they're willing to accept the risk that climate, they might not be ready for climate. And some people are right in the middle. So in this one pathway or budget, we actually have a representation of value. Keeping in mind that this is 100 units, a budget of 100 units. Now that's above and beyond your normal operating sort of situation. And in fact, that is, the literature is quite consistent on this and has been for a while, especially in terms of cost benefit analysis. So in a nutshell, this more or less prepares us for the working group, but there is one last one, and we call it a type 4. Now, how this occurred was we actually had, we presented this at a workshop, and we presented it to practitioners, planners, practitioners, government planners, and practitioners. And we put a number, and this is what we're going to do today. We put a number of adaptation options or strategies in front of them. And we said, can you classify these different types of strategies according to the different expenditure pathways? And they seemed to go okay until at one point, they were telling us that that's not what their job is about. Their job was about spending money now, so a lot of money now, but not all of it, so that we're prepared for climate change, so that we won't have to spend the full 100 units. And so this is a cheat. So they didn't follow the rules, but it's actually a cheat for the right reasons. They're saying these are 3 different adaptation types, but this is why we do what we do. We feel it's better to be prepared, but then maintain a level of preparedness. So they were saying that that is their justification, that sort of the raison d'etre of everything that they do. So here we are, we have these 4 adaptation types, and then this should set us up, Kim, for the group work. Let me see if there was, yeah, type 4 risks, yeah, expenditure pathways. We'll talk about gender. Well, we can talk about gender right now, or I'm getting a lot of, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, because I'm getting a lot of texts. Okay, so gender, what does gender have to do with this? Now, this is subtle. Okay, because I did quickly go into the literature on gender. And what did I find? Well, I found there's a lot of literature on perception of risk and gender. And it goes both ways. So in other words, I don't know, but I'm telling you that people are very aware of the idea that based upon gender, you could have a different perception of risk. And so I would tend to see it more along the lines of different people have different perceptions of risk. And so there has been an attempt in the past to suggest that men, and this is the male-female thing, this is the literature, not me, but that men are more risk seekers and women are more likely to be risk adverse. But what's interesting, a lot of the methods that are used for that deal with gambling. And so they are making generalities about gender perception of risk based upon gambling. And clearly that seems a little bit light. So there is something there. There's a literature there. Can't really comment on it, but that's really something for you to discuss within the working groups. So the last bit of information I'll give you, is this fine, Kim, that I would give them this?
Yes, but just for a moment, we just had a very recent question as soon as you asked that. So why don't you put it back on the screen?
Yeah.
And it talks about so the question is how to measure, or how would you decide which pathway is most effective? And this is a great conversation. This is a great question.
No, it's a great question. It really is. The premise is that when we look, okay, so this is this goes to the core of some very fundamental questions within society. If you are within a society that strongly believes in the marketplace, then you will believe, and in fact, many of the economists, now this is a body of people. After 2007, when the Stern report came out, there was an almost uniform rejection of the economic analysis done in 2007 to talk about the costs of climate change. And part of it was that economics presumes that we really do only spend, we're not willing to take on the uncertainty of the data that the scientists are giving us, and that markets are so adaptable that if they have to respond to climate change, they will. So there's a belief in market economics, and there's a belief that we really should push this off because money not spent is money in your pocket. In other words, the money will be spent in the future, and we could actually invest in money on the side and be well prepared for climate change when it happens. So there are, if you believe that, so that's a value orientation. The idea is that we believe in markets. We're not going to prepare for climate change. We don't have to. The markets and people will respond when it happens. What are we going to do? The alternative, though, is that now even those people would want a bridge well made. And so they will make allowances for well-built infrastructure. You know, we don't want that dam to burst. Well, even economists would say, yes, make it so it doesn't burst. So there are some things that are outside, they're within the public service, and they would say yes. So that would be a type 1 expenditure. And everyone more or less agrees that public infrastructure should be well built. There should be it should have a safety factor, you know, within it. And
So
yes,
Tim,
yes.
yeah, so it sounds like to me, I am just trying to summarize here what you're saying and making sure I understand. So if your values are based in finance and having money to use right now, you would likely be picking your effective pathway would be the type 3. You're going to wait until it's really, people are really confident that something is going to happen, and then you spend your money. But if your value is public safety, if that's your the thing that drives you, then you would likely start to prepare up front. So that's really very interesting, because it does, our values play into it so much, but also our positions and our professions, right? Because if our position, if we are a public figure or a leader of a community, we're probably concerned about the public safety. Whereas with, you know, maybe our bankers, and so that type of position would be more interested in the type 3 expenditure. So that's very interesting. And the other thing that it makes me think of as well is that in certain sectors, and you've touched on this, but in forestry, in New Brunswick, it is going to take, you know, 60, 70 years, we hope at least, to harvest a tree. So if the climate is changing and we plant something today, but we're not going to benefit from it until the future, our decision, so instead of, you know, saying this is an expenditure type, our decision type is really, we've got to plant the right thing now so that 60 years later when we harvest it, it's going to have good value still.
Right. And forestry is a great example. Forestry is on the line because we do it for economic reasons, but given the long planning horizons, it doesn't make any sense economically. So especially in the boreal forest, we have such little trees. So forestry is an ethical, it tends to be something based upon ethics. We do forestry ethically. It's not, there are places in the world where you can do it purely for economic gain. Georgia, different parts of the world, in different parts of the tropics, of course, eucalyptus trees, things like that. But in the far north, in the north, it tends to be lean much more towards maintaining ecosystem services through time, and that's the standard forestry tenet. You do not lower the productivity of the site. Yes, it's a public service. Yes.
So so we're getting a bit of conversation here going, Jim. So the other thing, I think I would like to D2G suggest maybe we can see if there's someone from the water group who might comment a little bit, but as someone maybe thinks of something they want to share, Zidane says all these might be too human-centered. So if you're comfortable coming off of mute, Sitting, I invite you to. Oh, good. So explain what you mean by that comment. That would be great.
Because I think all these discussions, like how to expend this money to protect the environment, like to change the climate change, it's all based on our purpose, based on human purpose. And even with the
Yes.
discussions, right, James discussed how economists decide to use this money, it's still very human centered. But the climate change do influence many natural things, not only about us. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes,
It
That's
is.
my
yes.
It is, except
Yeah.
that I think, and you're absolutely right, in a perfect world, we would be letting, nature lead our decisions. And that is, but I think what we're saying is that we exist, our decisions, it's what we've got, right? It's the decisions are human centered, but we generally don't make another choice. And that is also based on our values. But maybe Jim, you also want to respond to that?
That's more of a philosophical question. So when we talk about intrinsic value, I think you make a really good point. We do discuss intrinsic value, and the idea is that nature in and of itself has value. And that's why the discussion of value very quickly changes and why we've kept it at the economic level. The model or the perspective we're using is a human perspective, and it is that view of nature. And it is true that we tend to see nature in the future in a declining way. So in other words, the flip side of buying, I don't know, stocks or bonds or something like that is that we expect a return. But we can flip that around and say we can discount based upon the return that we get. So we tend to see nature in a much more narrow sense from an economic perspective. In fact, we tend not to see anything past 30 years as not existing. Now, there are reasons why that's a fun thing to do. And when I say fun, if you didn't do that, the future would weigh down upon you. So just a simple mathematical fact that if we were making decisions for 1,000 years from now, that would weigh down upon us. And
So Jim,
yeah.
We have you've got a lot of comments going on here, so I'd like to make some room for them. And so we're going to start with Aditya's question, but then we're going to hopefully hear from some people from the water group. And if Asha, you'd like to speak, or we can give you an example of agriculture you can respond to. But let's start with Aditya G. Go ahead, Aditya.
Yeah, thank you, Kim, and thank you, James. Actually, I was listening. Very interesting, your presentation, and I was just going over these types of decisions, and adaptations that are there. So I was thinking, you brought the gender perspective into this, but certainly they are political perspectives also looking in terms of decision and adaptation measures that we take. Certainly in South Asia. So how do you think, political interest, political culture, the social culture that is there can influence this type of, decision making,
Absolutely,
And,
absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. These are generalizations. Like if we look in the past and we say what we did in the past, that's a representation. So we can look at the past and look and see what we did. And generally, we do act like a type 3 sort of expenditure. But that is partially a political decision. It's based upon the fact that in North America, that we give a dominant view to the economic or the market. And so we assume that the market, and it's entirely up to you, but it is strongly political that we assume that the market will solve these problems, so that we tend not to spend a lot of money on the environment. We tend not to spend a lot of money on any of those factors. And in fact, absolutely, it's an ideology. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, but what I'd like to say here is one thing I always encourage Jim to do, and he just completely ignores me. No, I'm teasing. Yeah. One thing I encourage is also not to think necessarily of these as dollars or as monetary.
True,
so
true,
what
true.
we're
Yeah.
so what we're doing right now, this
Yes.
investment that each of us and our organizations
Mhm.
are doing to integrate gender.
Oh,
Now,
good.
you know, so we're putting a lot of upfront effort
Yeah.
in a gender workshop.
Yes.
And then we're hoping that that investment, it's an educational investment, it's not necessarily money. All of us will go out and share this information. So we're putting this investment in upfront, so type 1, and we're hoping that it's going to keep us all very adapted for the natural systems and the social systems by being able then to include gender and mainstream gender. So
That's a good
what
point.
I'd like to do now is maybe we can have someone, Bimala, are you interested in sharing a comment or two? I see that you're participating in discussion here.
I just shared my views, that's all.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So are you saying that we have to turn the system around so that it is more nature-centered?
Absolutely, yes.
Good. Yes. Okay. So it would be interesting if when we get into group, we could also discuss what that would look like, right? How would we change our decisions if we were considering the planet and the ecosystem first? What would those decisions then look like? I'm going to hypothesize that they would look a lot more like expenditure type 1. However, I think it would really be good to hear from you folks.
Sorry, Kim, can I quickly come in?
Yes, of course.
Yes. So I think it will be good to have maybe a 10-minute break before we head into the group work. Would that work?
I think that, yes, there's a lot to
Yes,
think
please.
about here, and that would be a great idea. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back here so that we can then go into group and really discuss this, because I think we've hit on some interesting conversation here about risk and value. So yes, go ahead, Nishkant, and you can guide us to break.
Yes, thank you so much, Kim and Jim. So it's 11:08 right now. Maybe a 10-minute break where we have say till 11:18. If you can please come back here, and then we take it forward from there. So please enjoy your break. Thank you so much.